All right, today we are diving into a challenge that comes from a prompt that sounds so simple. But trust me, this one little sentence, well, it opens up a whole universe of complexity. Here it is. Make up a good story about the United States. That's the whole thing. And at first, it sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? But the more you sit with it, the more you realize just how massive that task really is. A good story about the entire United States? I mean, seriously, where do you start? What events do you include? Which ones do you leave out? And maybe the biggest question of all, whose perspective do you choose to tell it from? You see, it's not just a creative puzzle, it's an ethical one too. So today, let's try to build a framework for how you could actually answer that question. Okay, so first things first, we have to think like a weaver. It's a great metaphor. Before you can even dream of creating a tapestry, you've got to do the groundwork. You have to gather your threads. A national story like this isn't just spun out of thin air. It has to be woven from the real, tangible fabric of history. And that means everything. The triumphs, the tragedies, the incredible ideals, and yeah, the hypocrisies. All of it. These are our raw materials. And when you start gathering those materials, you immediately run into the massive contradiction at the very core of the American story. On the one hand, you have these beautiful, soaring ideals in the Declaration of Independence. On the other, you have the brutal reality of slavery. You have the promise of the American dream right alongside the existence of systemic inequality. If you want to tell an honest story, you have to be willing to hold all of these threads in your hands, the bright ones and the dark ones. And this contrast right here, it gets at the central tension of the whole project. The nation's motto is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. It literally promises a single, unified story. But the historical reality, it's a story of constant, profound conflict and division. So your job as the storyteller is to somehow weave these two opposing ideas into a coherent whole. So once you've gathered all these different threads, you can't just toss them in a pile. That's not a story, that's just a mess. You need a pattern. You need a central idea to guide your work. In other words, you need a theme. A theme is what turns a boring list of events into a meaningful narrative. It's like the lens on a camera. It's the way you choose to interpret all the facts. It's what answers the really important question. So what? What is this story actually about? For example, you could decide to tell a story of progress. This version would frame American history as a slow, often really difficult, but ultimately forward march toward fulfilling its founding ideals. That journey of becoming a more perfect union. Or maybe it's a story of struggle. This version wouldn't see a straight line of progress. It would focus more on the reoccurring battles for power, for justice, and for identity. This story would highlight the constant fight by marginalized groups just to get their rightful place in the nation's promise. Or how about this one? A story of redemption. This theme wouldn't ignore the nation's deep flaws. In fact, it would start with them. But it would suggest a capacity for self-correction, for atonement. It's a story about confronting your sins and trying to be better. And what's wild is that each of these themes uses the exact same raw materials, but man, they weave a very different tapestry. Okay, so you have your threads. You've chosen a theme. Now it's time for the practical part, actually weaving the narrative together. How do you give it a structure? A really simple and powerful way to do this is with a classic 3-act structure. You establish the promise, then you introduce the conflict that tests that promise, and finally, you look toward where that whole struggle is leading us. So, Act 1 is the founding promise. This is where you lay out the core principles that the whole story is built on. You bring out those big ideas like all men are created equal or the dream of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the ideal that your story is going to revolve around. Then comes Act 2. And this is the heart of your story, the central conflict. It's all about the gap between that beautiful promise and the messy reality. This is where you find the Civil War, the fight for suffrage, modern debates about justice. This is where all the tension and drama live. It's what makes the story compelling. And finally, Act 3, the unfolding future. A national story never really ends, does it? So your conclusion shouldn't try to tie everything up in a neat bow. It's really about pointing forward. It's about suggesting what the stakes are for the future and leaving your audience with a sense of hope, or maybe a warning, or an ongoing question. This brings us to our final and maybe our most important section. We've talked a lot about how to make a story, but let's go all the way back to that one critical word in the original prompt. What does good even mean in this context? It's not just about being well-structured or entertaining. When you're talking about a national narrative, that word good, it carries an ethical weight. It's about the purpose and the impact of the story you choose to tell.
So, what might make a national story good? Well, it has to be honest, right? It has to confront the difficult truths, not just ignore them. It needs to be inclusive, so it reflects the millions of different American experiences. It needs to be complex, so it avoids painting simple heroes and villains. And finally, maybe it should be hopeful, not in a naive way, but in a way that actually inspires us to keep working on that unfolding future.
Because here's the ultimate takeaway. The stories a nation tells about itself are incredibly powerful. They aren't just history lessons. They are blueprints for the future. They define our shared identity, our values, and our sense of what is even possible.
And that brings us right back to the beginning. That prompt isn't just some hypothetical exercise. We are all telling and retelling the story of America every single day, in what we choose to remember, what we value, and how we act. So after all this, after gathering the threads, choosing a theme, and thinking about what makes a story good, what story will you tell?